You hear me? Yeah. Okay. How about you in the back row? Yep. Okay, thank you. That's a nozzle from the very first rocket that I ever shot on the 4th of April, 10th of April of 1952. Okay, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Let's start off with the beginning of the White Sands Proving Ground, right across the San Andres Mountains there. It's a 40 mile by 100 mile, 40 mile wide by 100 long piece of desert like this one, and it was put together by the United States Army in 1945. Right up at the very tip end of it, the San Andres has a gap, and it's called Mockingbird Gap. Then the Oscura Mountains start just beyond that. And at that location is where the first atomic bomb, the implosion bomb, Fat Man, was fired on the 10th of July of 1946. Okay, 1945, Bill, thank you. 1945, obviously. Okay, and then they carried the two bombs, the uranium bomb, U-235 bomb, and the plutonium bomb over to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we all know what happened then. And the war was over by the 10th of August. And my brother-in-law was very happy because he was on a troop ship heading for Japan. Okay, and at that same general time frame, the White Sands Proving Ground became an Army Ordnance Corps guided missile test range. It was called Proving Ground, and it's now Missile Range, starting about 1948. And so what happened was, at the end of the war, Dr. Werner von Braun was at Peenemünde. That means the mouth of the Peene River. Munde is mouth, over in the Baltic Sea, just off the coast of what was later to become East Germany. And Dr. von Braun had been there testing with his people V2 rockets. They had a whole series, A1, A2, A3, A4. A4 was the one that later became called V2 by Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's propaganda minister, who said this is a vengeance weapon. Those guys are bombing our cities, and this is a vengeance weapon. Okay, the Germans had been bombing the Brits before that. Okay, so at the end of the war, nearing the end of the war, Dr. von Braun decided that Germany was going to lose, so he took off with his crew and went south to the Wolf's Lair, where Hitler was. And on the way down there, his driver fell asleep and he was wrecked. And from then on, he carried a great big cast like this with a brace on it, and he was in great pain. And when they got down into the border with Austria, he decided he would send his younger brother, Magnus von Braun, M-A-G-N-U-S, to go out and find the Americans and say, hey, we've looked at the Brits, we've looked at the French, we've looked at the Russians, we've looked at the Americans. We know we've had it, and we'd like to surrender ourselves to you. And so Magnus went out on his bicycle, and he was just a kid. I think he was about 16. I met him many years later. I didn't know him then. And he went looking for the Americans, and he found a GI walking down the road with his M1 rifle, and he said, hi there, I'm with the German V2 team, and I'd like to surrender the group. My brother I'm acting for my brother. And the GI said, hey kid, get out of the way, I'm busy, I'm doing something else. Because nobody told him that we had a huge team of people over in Germany looking for the V2 scientists. Because the US realized the Germans were way ahead of everybody else in large rockets. And they wanted to learn how to use large rockets, or build them and use them, and then improve upon them with generations of weapons. And so the kid, Werner said to Magnus, hey, go back out there again. I'm sure we're going to be able to make contact soon. So he did. And so when the kid reported to his sergeant that he had seen this crazy German kid running around on a bike saying something about surrender, what was he surrendering? He was just a kid. And his boss, his sergeant said, "Oh, that's the bunch we've been looking for, idiot." So they all went back and everybody made contact the next day. And there was a Captain Dornberger in that group with Werner. Now, von Braun had been a member of a German rocket society in Berlin back before the war, and there were German rocket societies all over the place. And a good friend of mine whom I met later when they all came over here, Konrad Dannenberg, was from a different rocket society. And so a young Captain Dornberger said, oh no, Hitler did not believe in rocket weapons. He thought they were silly. But the World War I provisions were that after Germany was lost in World War I, they were not supposed to have any artillery. So then finally, Dornberger and others convinced Hitler that if we did V2s, that wasn't a violation of the treaty, and let's go ahead and do it. So in 43, roughly, he gathered up some of these German Rocket Society kids, including von Braun, whom he knew, and said, hey, let's go up to Peenemünde and we'll set this island aside and go do some testing. So they did. And I cannot remember the name of the guy who was parallel to von Braun at that time. There were two civilians, then a bunch of military. Oh no, there were a bunch of civilians, but von Braun and his competitor were always trying to get control of the organization. So they then began developing the A1 and the A2 and the A3 and the A4. And they started launching them out into the Baltic Sea. And they were having a heck of a time in the beginning. They had a alcohol tank and a LOX tank, liquid oxygen tank, in an exterior shell that was all steel. All the stuff was steel. It was heavy as the dickens. And the steel sheets that were used to make the skin on the rocket were beaten into shape with ball-peen hammers by Polish slave laborers. And they were rough and irregular, and then they got welded once they got into the particular shape they were looking for. The fins were built the same way, the nose cone was built the same way. It was a pretty rough and rugged machine, and it weighed about 14 tons, okay? And so they did a series of these firings, and in the beginning they couldn't make them work. They kept blowing up on the pad all the time. And the reason was they were using a cryogenic liquid, LOX, and they were pumping that stuff with a hydrogen peroxide plant that spun a turbine that pressurized and squirted the fuel into the combustion chamber through a shower head injector design. It had 18 little shower spray heads in it, and my friend Dannenberg was involved in that design. And anyway, von Braun was involved in propulsion and aerodynamics and telemetry and research in space and all that kind of stuff. He was a very broad person. Then he had individuals who were bosses of each group of Germans at that time. And so this guy and he were competing for power. Dornberger had become a general by this point, or maybe a colonel by then, I don't know. And so the word got out from the Polish slave laborers to the Brits that, hey, there's something going on over here. There was also the B-1 being built on another part of the island. And they said, hey, you ought to come in here and blow this thing up, or you're going to be in trouble. Okay, let me get back to the problems with explosions. It turned out they had straight piping between the cryogenic tank and the several thousand degree thrust chamber, and the expansion and contraction of that during the light up process would automatically tear up all the joints, and you'd get a mix of alcohol and LOX. They used a mixture of alcohol and water for the fuel and for the propellant. no, for the fuel, and locks for the oxidizer. And and I think it was Dannenberg, he died at 95 a few years back, but he told me that, well, he was involved somewhat. He was a very modest man. But what he did is he curled the piping. And so when the piping got hot and cold, it would float like a spring, and it didn't rip up all the joints. And all of a sudden they started having successful flights. Now it's told that in 45 that the Germans actually got to space. They crossed the von Karman line. The Karman line. You know what the Karman line is? Okay, it's 100 kilometers. Okay, roughly 70 miles. Well, it turns out they got just almost to that, but they said, gee, we got to space. And I always write Conrad about that. You didn't really get to space before we did. Anyhow, okay, end of the war. There was a crew under the auspices of the General Electric Company under Dr. Richard Porter, and an Army crew under, well, a bunch of guys, but a Colonel Herb Karsh, and I'll come back to the other colonel because he became the first commander of the White Sands Proving Ground. They were out there in Europe and Russia in the Russian zone. You remember we split up England. No, that we split up Germany, and there were different zones of occupation, and the Russians were coming in to their zone. The war was over, and so there was a place in the Harz Mountains where these rockets were being put together. The originals were built at Peenemünde, and those were the rockets that von Braun and his team used. But then the military used their research to build a bunch of rockets in the Harz Mountains. And what they would do is they'd take them out to a spot somewhere in Germany. They had a portable launch facility, just a platform with a spike in the middle to deflect the flow of the hot flames. And they would then launch them at England. Now they had a whole lot of trouble in the beginning because they were getting breakups as the bird exited the sensible atmosphere and came back down in again. They were snapping off the warheads. The birds were not working well, but they ultimately got that problem solved. They had 2,000 pounds of amytal, which is an explosive, in the warhead. And they started hitting London and Antwerp, Belgium, and other places. And but these were indiscriminate weapons. They weren't precise. They couldn't hit within a mile or two of where they were pointing, and so they used them as terror weapons. They were shooting V1s at the same time, which were pulse jet drones, big wing and a pulse jet motor, which has a sort of a Venetian blind in the front of it, and the air comes in spurts, and it sounds like as it goes overhead. Well, it does. And they launched them off long rails along Calais and along the coast there in France. And they were bombarding the English countryside. But England won the air war, Battle of Britain, with Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes and things. And they were whipping the ME-109s and the other the German aircraft. So the Germans said, well, we're going to have these V1s and we'll fire those so we aren't killing off all of our pilots. And they were running out of troops and qualified pilots. So the Brits worked out the technique of flying along as they came over the channel before they got to England, or even in the countryside after they got to England, but long before they got to London. They would fly along and put one wing under the wing of the V1, and they compressed the air and flipped the V1 on its back, and it would go down and crash. And then, so the V1s weren't doing the job. So finally, Hitler said, you know, I think we better have something else. And that's about the time that von Braun and his gang, the German rocket scientists, we called them here in the later years, that's when they started to have some successes. Not a lot, but some. And so that's when the program really began to roll. And, pardon me, I'm trying to get to the point about the V1s. Well, anyway, they went away and the vengeance weapons began to take over. Okay, then the war came close to the end, and I've led you through that for a bit. And so the Americans took 108, well, von Braun picked a team of 118 guys, no gals, and he brought them over, they were brought over, and one of the Germans, and I can't remember his name, had taken all of the documentation, the drawings and documents to discuss how to build V2s. You got to have that when you have the hardware. And he had put that in a cave in the Hartz Mountains and dynamited the entrance. And so nobody knew where the stuff was, or where the documentation was. And ultimately, somebody convinced him, okay, we're going to go with the Americans, so come on, let's get this stuff. So the Americans went over into the Russian zone and stole, basically, 100 sets of parts, and they put them on 300 rail cars and snuck them to the coast and put them on ships and sent them to New York. And 118 guys came along, and they were the cream of the crop. They were scientists, they were engineers, they were outstanding technical people. Von Braun himself was a heck of an engineer and a heck of a scientist, and wonderful, wonderful leader. His people just loved him. So they all were brought over to an island in New York Harbor, and the Americans interviewed them and debriefed them, tried to learn as much as they could, and then they shipped them down to Fort Bliss, Texas, which is down here just across the border of Texas and New Mexico. And they went to the William Beaumont Hospital, which was handling casualties from World War II, but the war was over, so the beds were free now, and so they parked all the fellas there. They were not interned, but they were kept pretty closely watched. And they then began to develop the Hermes Roman numeral II. Okay, now the Hermes program is what, okay, General Electric under Dick Porter got the responsibility for putting these birds together with advice and counsel from the Germans, and so they're the ones who were on base at White Sands, and the Germans came up. Not all of them came up. Some were working on Hermes too, and I'll get to that in a minute. But they wanted to develop the next set of transportation, which ultimately led to the Redstone. At that point, it was just a Hermes. So when we'd have a launch, about 40 of von Braun's people would come up from El Paso, roughly, and they would work with GE and the Army Ordnance Corps and a group of GIs who had gotten drafted. Now this is coming along towards 1950. I'm jumping ahead a little bit to explain the broomstick scientists. There were a bunch of highly educated engineers. They had masters and PhDs from Caltech and MIT and places like that. They got drafted, and they were sent out here to the desert to learn how to build large rockets and develop new ones, and that's how the Army got into the program deeply. Okay, one of those is a good friend of mine still today, named Bob Alley, and he and his gang were put in barracks buildings. And one of the lieutenant colonels there said, those guys are about as much use to me as a closet full of broomsticks. And so they just adopted that with pride and said, okay, we're the broomstick scientists. And those guys, they were kids then, came out and worked with the Germans and Dick Porter's crowd. Most especially a guy named Pappy White. He was about 6 years older than his compatriots. Everybody called him Pappy. He was a West Virginian kind of guy. And and everybody liked Pappy. So they would come up from White Sands. Everybody would get together in the Missile Assembly Building. If anybody goes out to White Sands on the way home from here, be sure you go over and get the tour and go to the missile garden in the museum, and it's just off the highway. It's open every day in the week, and except the holidays, I guess. I don't know. And anyhow, so they would put the birds together. Well, first of all, they were shipped down to Oro Grande Siding, which was well out in the desert near the Alamogordo Highway, Alamogordo to El Paso Highway, Highway 54. And there was a siding there, and they trucked all of the parts up to the Missile Assembly Building. Now, there was no such thing as a clean room in those days. You know from last night that the wind does blow, and you get sand and dirt and everything else, and all the parts. You were suffering the same agonies last night as they did then. And so they put these birds together, and the first one that was launched, not Toftoy, Colonel Porter, no, Dick Porter. I'm going to come back to him in a minute. I'm getting old. The colonel would put everybody together, and then they had the first launch. And it took off and went that away, like one of the rockets did today. I guess it was the first cruise missile. I don't know. I'm sure. Okay. Anyway, the first one was a big flop. I'm trying to get this colonel's name. Okay. Anyway, he had courage. By golly, we're going to put another one together, and they just had a thrust stand out there like they had been used. And the Germans had been using in Germany. And there was no gantry crane, there was nothing to work on. You went up on the German ladder, they called it an extension ladder, like a fire ladder. And the LOX truck would come along, and the alcohol truck, and they'd fuel it and get the gyros going and pop the Stotz plug, which eliminated ground power, which switched from ground power to internal power, and the rocket would take off. And the way they did that was they had a pre-burn where they'd let a little alcohol and LOX through, and then they had a spinning igniter in the field, in the exit cone of the nozzle, and that's what would light. And they'd get the fire built, and they'd run it and check it and get it adjusted properly, pretty much like the shuttle did, for a little while before you know you've got a good bird. And then they would go to main stage, which was called Brennschluss. And then the bird would burn for about 60 seconds. And then it had 54 tons of thrust. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yeah, that's here. I'm a heavy drinker, I can see. Well, I think Sherry already gave me one, but I'll slug another one. So then the engine would operate. And for steering, it had thrust vanes, jet vanes in the thrust chamber, in the nozzle, okay, in the exit plane of the not the plane, but a ways up in the nozzle. And these could be maneuvered in order to steer the engine. The bird, there wasn't a gimbaled nozzle, that came later on the Viking and the MX-774, but here they were just using the jet vanes. And those were connected to some aerodynamic surfaces out beyond the main trapezoidal fins. There were some little complementary triangular shapes out there that helped a little bit to steer it while it was still in the atmosphere. Okay, it would burn out after 60 seconds on its way up, and what would happen is that as soon as you shut it down, it would start to tumble because it was leaving the atmosphere, no aerodynamic restraints. The jet vanes weren't helping you anymore, and it had been made by these poor slave laborers, and they were starving to death, and the metal was rough, and the boundary layer was probably this thick, and so anyway, it had tumbled end over end. Well, okay, the Naval Research Laboratory was engaged by the government in Washington, D.C. to go around the country and talk to universities and government research labs, like the Air Force Research Laboratory in the Boston area, in Bedford, Air Force Cambridge Research Center, under, well, I can't remember his name, I knew him, but anyway, so they would So then they went around to the University of Michigan and Caltech and the JPL crowd at Caltech and the GALCIT team, which was Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. They gather up people like this and say, would you like to share a ride to space? We've got 2,000 pounds, a metric ton, of space up there, and we have to fill the warhead or the darn thing won't be aerodynamically stable. Static margin will be wrong and we're going to tumble on the pad. So come on, let's go do research. And so a bunch of scientists who didn't know squat about space research or the upper atmosphere or anything else said, okay, sounds like fun. What's not to like? So a whole bunch of guys got together. Now, if I took all of you people here and put you together in one payload with all your experiments and said, okay, let's meet this schedule, I don't think it'd work too well. So there were just lots and lots and lots of delays. Now I was in 47, on Engineers Day of 1947, the Army brought a V2 over to New Mexico A&M College, was what it was called then. And they showed it around on Engineers Week. And we had been going out at night. I started in college in 45, and we'd go out at night and watch these V2s take off and leave vapor trails in the sky, like you did today. And we would measure the upper air winds by having a triangulation system made, and we would photograph the trails from 3 different locations. And as you know, those trails do this, but that's the wind up there. It's not your rocket flying this way. So we could measure upper air winds to the cutoff point of the second stage of the booster, the B2. It was a single stage bird. Okay, and all right. So NRL was charged with the responsibility for modifying the warhead, the structure, and putting in all kinds of panels and access doors and things so everybody could work, and there were decks in there you can mount your instruments and so on. Now I was lucky because I got to go out after I went to work there. I got to go out there and sit at, and by now we've built when I say we, I mean the United States. I was a tiny, tiny little ant running around here doing service jobs, and I wasn't one of the decision makers. But I could go out there on the gantry crane, and when there was a delay of 2 hours, 3 hours, 2 weeks, a month, the scientists that were there and the engineers were bored silly. They would be sitting around saying, oh boy, you want to go to Juarez tonight or what? And so I would go out there, and this is what I want to ask you to learn. Okay, this is a learning experience at this point. Okay, at Byram, okay, no, wait a minute. In the beginning, the V2s cratered on the way in, and they dug a pit about 60 feet in diameter, 60 feet deep. And when we flew densitometer cassettes and spectrographs and aspect cameras and things like that, what we had was a bunch of melted steel at the bottom of the pit, and I'd go out on recovery with some of those. But the Army or GE or the whiz kids, we called them whiz kids, but the broomstick scientists they came up with the idea of putting 4 quarter-pound blocks of TNT at the base of the warhead section and blowing the nose off on the way back down. After it had done its research, they'd blow it off. Now I want to point out that when you were trying to decide where you were looking up there and the B2 is tumbling all over the place, and suppose you're doing solar physics and you want to know what the 1217 angstrom line of oxygen was on the sun and so on, well, your detector would go whew, whew, by the sun at high rate of speed, and you'd get maybe a few seconds of data out of a 15-minute flight. So well, anyway, we would go out uprange, maybe 50, 60, 70 miles after a launch, a bunch of us grunts, and the Navy grunts and the Army grunts and so on in jeeps, and we'd head uprange And we would go and recover the packages we had on board. And after they blew the nose cone off, that worked pretty well. We began to get pretty good stuff. Then they began to develop a system for rotating the nose cone independent of the mid-body, and also having a package of instruments, and they blow off some panels and they could move that in pitch and this in roll, and they could focus on the sun while the mid-body is doing all this nutty stuff. And that really made a difference. Then we began to get a lot of data. We began to get a lot of data, and so then we began switching over to things like photon counters, which were basically Geiger tubes with windows in them. And we, the Naval Research Laboratory, put different elements in there as filters, such as, the quench gas was alcohol, and they had a high voltage wire running down the center. And when a cosmic ray would come through the window, then you'd get a ping on your telemetry record, and then the quench gas would shut that one down, and then you get another one and another one. You get a lot of secondary cosmic rays down here, but the heavy primaries were well above the sensible atmosphere. So, okay, Ed Byram was the technician who built those things for Dr. Talbot Chubb and Dr. Newell was in a different part of the laboratory. But anyway, Herb Friedman. And Dick Towsey was the boss of the whole bunch. Okay, so when I was out there at night, getting ready to take the telemetry records back to the campus and process the 9.5 inch by 200 foot rolls of film the night of the launch, and then prints of those, and then run them back out to the proving ground and give a set to von Braun and his people, and to the Army Ordnance Corps guys, and to the principal investigators, and so on. And so when there were delays, what I would do is go to Ed Byram and say, Mr. Byram, I understand that on the 1.7 kc channel of the Navy A&D KT7 telemeter that you have the voltage of your Geiger tube, your photon counter, and that's where you get the pings. Now, could you tell me how you built that? And he's sitting out there on the gantry crane, bored out of his skull. He said, oh, okay, kid, come on over, let me talk to you. And so I got to know him, and I got to know how he built his photon counters. Then I'd go over to Dr. Talbot Chubb, who had a habit of talking like this. And if you had to stand back to keep from getting spit on. And he was a mad scientist type guy, but a real great guy. And I'd say, Dr. Chubb, I understand that you're using because Ed told me, you're using a lithium fluoride bead in order to pass the wavelength of the sun of 1216 angstroms. And he'd say, oh, okay, kid, you speak the language, come on in and I'll talk to you. You learn a little of the language, you know a little bit about how it's built, and Dr. Chubb then begins to tell you all about the actual details of how this is built and how you have to build things in to operate in a vacuum and blah, 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 blah. And then, after a while, I'd go in to see Dr. Friedman, and I'd say, Dr. Friedman, why do you care about the 1216 line of 1216 angstrom line of oxygen on the sun? Oh, let me tell you about that. And he was a sweetheart. And so he'd tell me all about solar terrestrial physics, how eruptions on the sun create disturbances in the upper atmosphere of the Earth, which disturb the magnetic field and the production of ions in the atmosphere. And so he'd lead me down that path. Then I get up to Dick Towsey and I say, Dr. Towsey, and I worked my way all the way up to the top. And I had a private set of instructors, just little old me, sitting up there on the gantry crane. And they liked that. So whatever you do, for Pete's sake, seek out the people who really know what's going on in your field, and be not dismayed by the fact that they're high mucky mucks. They want to talk to young people. and they get bored waiting around for rocket launches or getting their tires fixed or whatever. Seize on every opportunity you can get. Here's another trick. When you go to a scientific lecturer, and let's say Jim Van Allen is giving a speech on how I discovered the magnetosphere of the Earth and the Van Allen radiation belts. He didn't name the Van Allen belts. He was a modest guy, but somebody else did. The radiation belts around the Earth and how the sun, when it blows, you have a coronal mass ejection, and you burp all this plasma toward the Earth. Mostly it can go in 4 pi steradian directions, so it can go anywhere, but if we're lucky or unlucky, in our orbit, we'll be in the right place for this cloud of plasma to come slamming into our magnetic field, and our magnetic field looks like the skin of an apple, and on the sun side, the magnetic field gets crunched by this mass of plasma, but it can't get in, and so it gets deflected around the Earth into the magnetotail. And the magnetic field on that side gets disturbed, and begins to look like a flapping flag in a breeze. And then the field is lower, and all these energetic particles can sneak into the magnetic field, and then magnetic reconnection takes place. And pow, just like a rubber band, you slam all this stuff in, and all these energetic particles come roaring down the magnetic lines of force in the auroral zone and the austral zone, and you get aurora borealis and aurora australis, and the atmosphere at high altitudes becomes ionized, and you have up to 23 ionized iron coming along in these, not just electrons and protons and alpha particles, that sort of thing. Heavy particles are coming in also, and all these slam down into the Earth's upper atmosphere, 200, 300 kilometers, 400, 500 up there, and you begin to get these auroras, and what happens is the atmosphere heats up and swells up. Now we're going to jump to satellites, and the satellites that are up there in LEO orbits, low Earth orbit, experience increased drag, and fortunately, a lot of the debris that we have up there also gets influenced by this higher density atmosphere, and they're whizzing around at 25,000 miles an hour, and you have enormous drag forces, and so these drop out of orbit and burn up, and the coronal mass ejections are man's friend, and women's friend too, because they clean a lot of the garbage that we put up there and is there naturally from entering meteors and things like that. And that just wipes out a whole lot of junk. But if you want to know what's up there and you want to know whether it's going to slam into your space station or your military snoop device or whatever, you have to be able to predict when the events, you can see the event coming. It takes 9 minutes to get here from the sun at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second or 186,000 miles a second. And that's what the X-rays come out, but these energetic particles come along at much, much lower speeds, hundreds of kilometers a second. So you have time, you know it's coming, okay? And electric utilities around the world used to have problems during sunspot cycles when you had a lot of activity on the sun, lots of CMEs going on, and they used to short out everything. I remember when the whole northeastern United States and part of Canada were blacked out because all of the generators overproduced, the lines surge. You get an electromagnetic pulse, which increases the voltage in the lines, and you blow all the breakers or all of the systems that are supposed to control the voltage in the lines, 440s or whatever. And so what we do now is we have a satellite called ACE, and there are others that sit out there at the L shell number, at the Lagrange 1 point between the Earth and the Sun. You know what Lagrange points are? No, okay, some do, some don't. Okay, a point of equal gravitational potential between the Earth and the Moon. is called Earth and Sun is called L1, Lagrange 1. The point on the opposite side of the sun where there's, again, equal gravitational potential between the Earth and the Sun is called L2. L3, I know where L4 is. Okay. Anyway, that's one that is following the sun, following the Earth in its orbit around the sun. And so if you put things there, they'll stay. If you don't, they'll fall into the sun or they'll fall into the moon. Or there are other gravitational potential points between here and the moon. And so, or they'll fall back to the Earth. But L3, actually it is, that's following the Earth around. Don't check me on that. Following the Earth in its orbit around the sun. That point is a nice one because you don't have to hit it just right. You kind of circle around in that region. And if you want to go out there and hang around, why, that's a good way to do it. So anyhow, okay, so there are spacecraft at L1 who let us know that a big bunch of garbage is coming. And so the utilities spool their generators down in order to not to overvoltage the lines, okay? So we don't have any more blackouts in the country. That's one thing that satellites have really been useful for. Okay, now I want to talk about, okay, when you see a guy about to give, or a woman now, about to give a speech on some topic that you're interested in, walk up on stage. This person is nervous, and you know they're giving a speech before a big audience, and they're nervous, and there's nobody bothering them. So you go up on stage and you engage them in conversation, and you can talk about rise and fall of the Great Salt Lake due to sunspot cycles or whatever, but just engage them in conversation. If you try to go and talk to them after the speech, all the press and all the other people and the military guys are talking to the generals and all that stuff, you can't get in. You won't be able to. Talk to them before the speech. And don't be shy. My favorite human being on the surface of the earth is Neil deGrasse Tyson. That guy is something else. I have volunteered to become his campaign manager if he'll run for the president of the United States. And he won't do it. He says, what are you crazy? But he's wonderful. And I talked to him a number of times. So be sure to do that sort of thing, okay? Now another very valuable lesson, and I'm rambling, and who's got the hook? You got the hook. You got the hook. No, but don't hold up your hand. What are you going to do for the next hour? Okay, she's going to drag me off here. I really haven't gotten started.
No, Gil.
What?
Gil, you still have about 10 more minutes.
What did she say?
10 minutes.
10?
10.
Okay. All right. Okay, I want you to do something now. Okay, Geyer, where are you? Right here. Are you ready to do this thing?
Yeah.
Do you want to do it from there to here, or do you just want to do it out there? We don't have time to do it with the backdrop here. Okay, now, I've been in this game for 70 years. I started out in 1947, and I'm still active. And we fly Starshine satellites. Have any of you guys ever polished mirrors for the Starshine project about 10 years ago? Probably not. There's a big gap. We flew a bunch of these things on space shuttles and on our Lockheed Martin Athena 1 out of Kodiak, Alaska. And what these are, hollow spheres. This is another lesson. Don't make everything so dang complicated. You can gain great amounts of data with very simple techniques. Here's one. This satellite right here is called Starshine, Student Tracked Atmospheric Research Satellite for Heuristic International Networking Experiment. I like to make up names like that.
Nice.
Okay. So, I didn't stumble, did I? Okay. This is hollow. It's an aluminum 7075 T6 aluminum ball. And those are mirrors that are and the sun went down. Oh, darn. Well, it's not really down yet, Susan, but it's close. Okay. What did I do with that mirror? Well, did I give that to you? No. Okay. Well, okay. These little mirrors are about an inch in diameter, about 2.5 centimeters. By the way, don't say kilometer, because then you have to say centimeter, and millimeter, and decimeter, and kilogram of weight. It's kilometer, guys. It's a meter, and there are a kilo of them, 1,000. Okay. Anyway, this thing is about 2.5 centimeters across, 2.54. And what we do, these are aluminum, front surface. And we had kids in a tech school machine these out of rod stock. And I don't have the one, I do have the one here somewhere to show you. But this little mirror, this big, with a stop sticking out the back, were machined by the kids up at Bigger Lamb and Technology College in Utah. And my wife and I put together kits of grinding and polishing compounds and instructions and measuring devices and so on. And we parceled these out to 1,000 schools. We'd send 3 mirrors to 1,000 schools for each of the launches we did. And they would then have teams of 3 kids competing for these 3 mirrors. And they'd get, and I haven't got the details right now, but you go to my website, Starshine, there are other Starshines, but look around for the one that had Project Starshine that we did back in one solar cycle ago. And we would have the kids polish these mirrors and then stop polishing when they got to the right point. And then send me the 2 best ones, keep the worst one for the school trophy case. And then I would send these down to the Marshall Space Flight Center, and they would, aluminum, I'm getting into too much detail. Forget it. We would get these then coated with silicon dioxide over aluminum 1100. And we would then put the little stobs through the wall and put a spring on the backside and then put an E-clip on there so that as the aluminum structure grew and shrank as it went around the Earth in the low temperature, high temperature conditions up there in orbit, then these were independent and the flatness would not go away. We didn't destroy the work the kids had done. And so we did 4,000 of these. We have one, okay, then we'd take it to Goddard Space Flight Center and put it in a canister with an ejection system and take it down to the Cape and put it in the cargo bay of a space shuttle or up to Kodiak to put on the Athena. And when the astronauts got through at the space station, then when they started home and before they shut the doors, they'd kick the satellite out, okay? And they would, and the satellite would be in independent orbit for 6 months to a year and a half at an orbital altitude circular of something like 300 kilometers, okay, 400, 500. And that was the one that was higher. And then the kids would go, we had a website, and WWE radio is a time standard in the US, and you turn the radio on at 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 megacycles, then hertz now, and you could hear bing, 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 and at the top of a minute, this is radio station WWV wavering in the airwaves, and the time will be blah, 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 and you write that down, start the stopwatch, go outside, look up into the sky at sunset. A little bit later than this, when you can see the stars. Satellites up there still in the light. The astronauts kicked it out spinning, and you could watch it go blink, blink, blink. This little mirror was visible at distances up to 1,000 miles to the unaided eye. Your eyes, not mine. I'm old and mine are going. Mine is going away. That one did a long time ago. So you go out there and the kids would do GPS, or in the beginning a 7.5 quadrangle map because there wasn't any GPS. And you could see the satellite winkling, and then we would have on our website the astronomical chart for the evening. And so walk out there and wait till the satellite got between a couple of stars they could identify, and then stop the stopwatch, look at the GPS, write that down, write down the time. We knew where they were, we knew the time. If we knew what the right ascension and declination was that they picked off the chart, they'd send those back to me on email, and we could calculate the orbit of the satellite. And with 1,000 observations around the world, theoretically, then that's what we could do. Now, there are lots of clouds out there. And so not a lot, and bad seeing conditions in cities and along sea coasts and so on. So the kids got a huge kick out of polishing these mirrors and seeing them go by. That's my mirror. Out of 1,000 mirrors, I was sure that blink came from them, from theirs, and who's going to say no? And so, but we finally, okay, well, I'm running out of time, but the point is, we are probably going to fly one more of those on a brand new launch vehicle that's coming along. It was supposed to fly on the Columbia. Guess what happened? Columbia crashed, and we were on the next mission. So we've been sitting and waiting for, I don't know, 15 years. But finally, this new company is coming along to fly a new bird in a 300-kilometer polar orbit, and we almost have them convinced that maybe we could get a free ride. In the meantime, I used to fly spheres like this, and I'm quitting now. Suzanne, I'm almost done. Okay, this is a 10-centimeter sphere that weighs a kilogram. Now I put another one that was 1.5 kilograms and one that was 2 kilograms, filled it with commemorative sand from Dr. Robert Goddard's launch site on May the 16th of 1926 from Auburn, Massachusetts, and then from his launch sites here in New Mexico, near Roswell, New Mexico, after they ran him out of Massachusetts because he started a fire on his FFE's farm, and then from pad 39A where the shuttles used to go carrying these things, and so on and so on and so on. And now, wait a minute, I have to finish with this rocket. I worked on V2, Viking, Araby, Nike Tomahawk, Nike Cajun, Nike Apache, all over the world. But this was my very first rocket in April of 1952. And I fired it from White Sands, and we got to about 70,000 feet with it. Except on the first one, we were deploying a 24-foot diameter silk canopy that was radar metallized. And we got them tangled up. So it was a flop. The second one was fine. And then we put Aspen and Cajun and Apache motors on those, and we got to about 100,000. And then these were targets for Talos, Nike Hercules, Nike Ajax, Nike Hercules, Nike Zeus, blah, 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 blah. And then we started flying these as hurricane photography rockets and tornado photography rockets at Fort Sill, and the other was down at the Cape. And then we went all around the world putting barium clouds up there to study the electric field gradients in the ionosphere and so on and so on. And I have had just an absolute blast all of my life. You've chosen the right general field of research. This is more fun than anything there is. And so I encourage you, mainly, when you get going, when you get out of college, some of you are in college still, of course, when you get out of college, you start doing interesting things, and then you go back to the next crowd of kids that are coming along, and you help them go through college, and you fund them to get their companies started or whatever, and then whenever you need help from them for the next batch of kids, they just say, yes, sir, right away. Oh, yeah, I'll help you all you want. And that I have had, 70 years of having this game. That's a very important lesson. Help the next gang so that they will help you help the next gang. Okay? Okay, I guess I'm going to get run off. What's that? What is it? I forgot. Okay, I used to teach at the Air Force Academy in the Astro Department. And one of my cadets of 21 years ago is named Jack Fisher, Fischer. He's up in the space station, and I would like for you people to say, and I don't do it yet, "Hello, Jack!" And do it all in unison when I give the word, and then we'll type that up to him, and he'll get to see all your lovely faces here this evening and be encouraged to. He's having so much fun up there right now. Colonel Jack Fisher, just say Jack. All right, so 1, okay, on 3, I want you to say, "Hello, Jack." 1, 2, 3. Hello, Jack! Thank you. He's going to like that very much, guys. Thank you a lot.
On behalf of inaugural Spaceport America Cup, we are so honored. On behalf of the first annual Spaceport America Cup, we're so honored that you came to speak to us today. We have a special jacket for you. It's a Spaceport America rocket engineer jacket. Do you like that?
Yes, I do.
Wait, there's more. I have more gifts. We also have a rocket engineer polo shirt with a pocket for all of your important items. Okay. And that's something.
My gosh, I'm garbage for the rest of the year.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Okay, I handed out some stickers to some of you for our next satellite conference in Logan, Utah. I forgot to one last thing.
No, he's gone. I'm sorry.
Okay, I forgot. I was one of the founders with Dr. Paul Miller, if he's here. Paul, there he is. Paul Miller, I was the speaker at the first Ezra rocket launch up in Utah, and I've been a judge for him for about 10 years, and then I got dust pneumonia from all the dust that was blowing there, so I quit coming. But anyway, this outfit is cool, and the move down here is really cool. This is a keen place. The facilities and the potential of growth in this program here is just absolutely outstanding. Congratulations on coming here and participating in this program. We got to see you next year. Thank you very much.
That's why they call it a rocket bell. There.
I don't know if I'm gonna get in the shot. Yes, there are snacks.